Am I audible, Matinda?
Yes.
Yes. So, good evening, everyone. I am Mahmudul Hassan Dhabok, Assistant General Secretary of BASE and PhD Scholar, Department of English, University of Kalyani. I am very happy to greet all of you on behalf of organizer of this conference. At the outset, I want to say very few words about BASE, that is Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, is a developmental organization registered as a trust by a collective academicians, scholars, professional, and other like-minded people working for community and social development. We do a lot of academic and social activities to empower people and society at large. Along with other activities, we organize yearly conference. In 2019, we collaborated with Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Alia University, and we organized a huge conference. In 2020, due to pandemic, we had online conference. This is third annual conference of BASE, and for this year's conference, we are collaborating with the Ambedkar Center for Studies, Cultural Studies of Gaur Mahavidyalaya under University of Gaur Bango and the Department of English of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar College under University of Kalyani. We are very fortunate that we got Professor Zoya Hassan as keynote speaker on behalf of BASE, the Ambedkar Center for Cultural Studies of Gaur Mahavidyalaya and the Department of English, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar College. I heartily welcome Professor Hassan.
Thank you.
Uh, I'm very happy to announce name of other distinguished speaker of the conference, Professor Niladri R. Chatterjee, Department of English, University of Kalyani, Professor Tanvir Fazal, Department of Sociology, University of Hyderabad, Dr. Prasenjit Bishwas, Associate Professor, Northeastern Hill University, Dr. Rafat Ali, Associate Professor, Department of English, Jadavpur University, and Dr. Ghazala Jamil, Assistant Professor, Center for the Study of Law and Governance, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And I heartily welcome them. I also welcome distinguished academicians, scholars, and students from different universities and colleges. Now, I'd like to invite Professor Abdul Matin from Jadavpur University to introduce the theme of the conference and today's keynote speaker.
Good evening, everyone. It is thanks, Mr. Hassan, for this opportunity. Well, as we all know, Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, BASE, and in collaborations with Ambedkar Center for Social and Cultural Studies, Gaur Mahavidyalaya, affiliated to University of Gaur Bango, Malda, and also the Department of English, B.R. Ambedkar College, affiliated to University of Kalyani. In collaborations with the institute, we are basically organizing a virtual conference, 3-day virtual conference on the theme of belonging and homelessness. This is 3-day conference, and also we have engaged with different academics, people from different universities in India. Well, as you all know, in the contemporary world, we see the upsurge of the right wing or far right politics across the world, whether it is India, Brazil, Spain, Germany, France, Turkey. We see everywhere we see an upsurge of far right political parties and, of course, political culture. In the contemporary time, we also witness different forms of homelessness. We are not necessarily saying homelessness in its literal sense, it's also in cultural sense and different other aspects. We see political, religious, ethnic, gender, and different kind of racial and sexual vulnerabilities. And the refugee crisis, which is, it could be ecological refugee. These days we have words called the climate refugees. Apart from this, also the kind of neoliberal political regime and how this neoliberal political regime is interacting with the very constitutional values which not necessarily the only Indian values across the world, which is the idea of liberty, idea of fraternity, idea of social justice, equity, how these new liberal institutions with the political party and the politics is engaging with this concept. Well, I don't want to take much time. We have papers on different aspects of on literature, culture, on the discourse of citizenship, the refugee crisis, ethno-nationalism, and of course, we have paper on the on caste, gender, and the questions of violence, both in India, and also there's a theoretical questions, also papers addressing different kind of theoretical debates. Without further ado, well, I am very much honored as well as privileged that we have Professor Zoya Hassan as our keynote speaker today. And I'm really and honestly speaking, she doesn't need any introductions, but there are certain customs we need to follow. Professor Zoya Hassan is Professor Emerita at the Department at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She was formerly with the professors at the Center for Political Studies at JNU, also the Dean of the School of Social Sciences. She was a member of National Commission for Minorities. She has been visiting professors to the universities of Zurich, Edinburgh, Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, Paris at Paris, and also at the Center for Modern Oriental Studies at Berlin. She has also worked on the research project of ICSSR. She was also an ICSSR fellow, national fellow. She has worked with the Ford Foundations, DFID, UN Research Institute for Social Development, ORF, and she's part of many research initiatives both in India and across the world. Has been also on the executive board, executive council of different universities, and also on editorial board of various national and international journals. Well, Professor Hassan has been the chairperson of the Center for Political Studies, and beyond that, she is the person, I think, she is an institution in herself. It's like the kind of institutions they build in campus in JNU, especially the Center for Discrimination Studies and Center for Women's Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Hassan also done extensively research on different policy work pertaining to higher education in India in relations to minorities. So then chairpersons of 11th five-year working group on empowering minorities, which submitted the report to the planning commissions, erstwhile now with this Niti Aayog. So also on the different educational boards, textbook committee at the Ministry of HRD, now which is called Ministry of Education. She was also part of National Integrations Council that time, and she played an active role in on preparing the report of Equal Opportunity Commissions, and many of us we have forgotten the entire debate of equity, the debate of social justice, the debate on inclusions. And apart from her administrative and policy things, she has extensively worked on the idea of affirmative action, social inclusions, and policy debates. And especially her books on recently books on Congress after Indira, policy, power and political change, and the politics of inclusions, caste, minority, and affirmative actions, unequal citizens, a study of Muslim women in India, quest for power and opposition movement in the post-Congress politics. Like so on. I mean, like, if I'll continue, it will be like on and on. Well, we are legally waiting for her new book, which is going to come in March 2022 at Oxford University Press. Now, without much delay, without much ado, I would like to invite and also like to welcome. And ma'am, this is over to you, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to speak at the inaugural session of the BASE Conference on Belonging and Homelessness. I'd like to thank the Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment, the Ambedkar Center for Social and Cultural Studies, as well as the Ambedkar College in Nadia. The theme that you've chosen for this conference is very appropriate and important, given that it's exactly 2 years since the equal citizenship protests, as I like to call them, rather than the anti-CAA protests, started on 15th of December 2019. So I think it is important that you are focusing on this theme of belonging uh, and homelessness, belonging here to the nation. I think my talk today hopefully will provide the political context for this theme, which, as I said, is an extremely important one. And I've just looked at the titles of the papers, and all of them seem very interesting, dealing with different aspects of ethno-nationalism, uh, citizenship, belonging, and so on, and more broadly, right-wing politics, which is exactly what I'm going to talk about, which is essentially, I mean, my talk will focus, as it were, on uh, majoritarianism and how that is reshaping Indian democracy. Now, India is a thriving democracy when it comes to elections and the peaceful transition of power, but a diminishing democracy when it comes to political freedoms. The regime loudly proclaims its democratic credentials based on its numeric majority in parliament, but this is limited to electoral politics. The assumption of power at the center by a right wing party in 2014 is the most important political development since independence. This has produced an ideological and institutional shift in governance and politics, especially manifest from 2019. The checks and balances of constitutional government have been weakened, freedom of expression has been curtailed, democratic deliberation has been bypassed, and major public institutions don't seem to function autonomously, and the government, as we know, has very little patience for popular public protests. The present government is both communal and authoritarian. These overlapping trends have contributed to an inner corrosion of the democratic system, although there is no rejection of democracy. In fact, there's a celebration of India as a mother of all democracies, as the Prime Minister recently said in the General Assembly meeting in New York in October. However, the overall objective is to create an authoritarian state with only a token opposition, either at the electoral or legislative forums, or at an ideological level in terms of alternative views and ideas. But until recently, democracy in India was doing quite well. But since the election of the right-wing party in 2014, we've experienced a breathtaking erosion of the rule of law and civil and political rights, and unleashing of a wave of intolerance against religious minorities. So today, there is a growing concern within the country and outside that something has gone wrong with India's democratic project. The details of the assessments may vary, but it seems the dominance of Hindu nationalists and the manner in which they have ruled in the past 7 years has given rise to claims that India's democracy has been diluted. Policies pursued by the government and the strategies of mobilization and polarization carried out by the Hindu nationalists from 2014 onwards bear significant responsibility for the shifts in the functioning of democratic institutions, which appear to be in line with the effort to build a Hindu state, which has been evident in the past few months, and especially in the past, and overall in the past 2 years. My lecture this evening tries to make sense of changes in India's political trajectory after the election of this government, which has given a push to rising authoritarianism and majoritarianism in India. In doing so, I will foreground the ideological and institutional dimensions of change to understand these shifts. This process has been advanced by the intersection of majoritarianism and authoritarianism under BJP rule. Now, these two processes, though separate and distinct, currently feed on each other to dilute and abate democratic politics. Conceptually, the political shift is powered by communal authoritarianism and Hindu nationalism, both of which are promoted by the connivance between state authorities and communalism. I will start with a brief discussion of majoritarianism and then move on to authoritarianism. Now, the decisive victory of BJP in 2019 parliamentary elections reinforced the right-wing trajectory India had embarked upon in 2014. The party's top leadership interpreted the verdict as a signal to establish a Hindu state, which was the declared objective of the RSS on its founding in 1925. This project has worked via a process of consolidation of Hindu dominance through authoritarian means and constant fear and stereotyping of the other. This has served to polarize the electorate by creating a permissive climate which has enabled a politics of division to hold sway. The change did not start with the BJP's rise to power in the 2014 election. What is novel, however, is its overall vision of India as a Hindu nation. That vision has driven a public discourse in which minorities, particularly Muslims, are openly vilified, and this has encouraged tolerance of extra-legal violence or vigilante violence against them. Things moved fast after 2019 when the re-election of the government. After the re-election, as the Prime Minister moved swiftly to reshape India's secular republic to match his vision of India as a Hindu-centric powerhouse. The majoritarian narrative rapidly found official expression in new laws and policies. The government pushed through a series of laws in quick succession, which had a direct impact on the constitutional commitment to the concept of equal treatment. The breathtaking advance of majoritarian politics was apparent in three major developments. The government began with the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A of the Constitution, which defined and protected the status of Jammu and Kashmir. In one stroke, the state ceased to exist and it came under virtual military occupation. The second development related to the Supreme Court's verdict, which pronounced that the disputed land in Ayodhya would go to a government-monitored trust to build a temple, and Muslims would receive a separate 5-acre plot of land in the city to build a mosque. Now, the apex court, now this judgment, of course, came from the Supreme Court, but it ensured that a temple would be built on the land where the mosque once stood, which by the court's own admission was illegally demolished. Now, the greater significance of this judgment lies in the tacit endorsement of majoritarian politics by the court, by the highest court. Assigning to the central government the task of setting up a Hindu religious trust to build a Ram temple implies that it was the government's duty to cater to Hindu religious interests. The court ruling was a huge victory for the ruling party, which had made the construction of the Ram temple a focal point of its political campaign and has contributed immensely to its rise to power. Now, the third major development, of course, which is going to be a major concern of your conference, are the changes in the citizenship law. Now, citizenship provisions in independent India avoided any communal or religious identification, adopting a birth-based rather than descent-based model. This has been changed, as we know, after the enactment of the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019, which establishes a hierarchy of citizenship based on religion by fast tracking citizenship for non-Muslim minorities in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh by creating an exemption from the illegal migrants category for 6 non-Muslim communities in these 3 countries, but it does not offer the same exemption to refugees and immigrants who happen to be Muslim. The amended law quickly occupied the center stage of Indian politics, and along with the proposed implementation of the National Register of Citizens, it sparked nationwide protests, galvanizing thousands of people in an unparalleled display of opposition against the new citizenship regime. This protest is significant, not the least, because it occurred despite a concerted effort to discourage people from raising inconvenient questions about the constitutionality of the amended law, and by implication, raising questions about the ideological and political agenda of this regime. Now, at a political level, then, it's clear from these 3 events, very significant events, that a religion, state, nation nexus has emerged, and it has already changed to some extent the nature of the state, as indeed of the republic. These 3 events challenged the core foundations of the Indian Republic, advancing the discourse of a redefinition of the state and nation in opposition to the secular definition enshrined in the Constitution. The Hindu nationalists, in contrast, saw religion as the strongest basis for a new national identity they were trying to craft. With an absolute majority in parliament, the regime was confident, and with good reason, that it can begin to operationalize this vision of a Hindu state. Now, the method for advancing this project is polarizing society on communal lines on the one hand, and on the other, seeking to combat dissent and shutting down anybody who raises inconvenient questions. But as we know, dissent is integral to democracy. But the space to differ has been encroached, which results in either self-censorship or arrests that have created an atmosphere of fear, anxiety, and mistrust. Any criticism of the state is labeled as anti-national, thus confusing dissent with disloyalty. This government, it is well known, is seriously averse to criticism, and to dissent. While every government, previous government, is guilty of similar abuses, the nature and scale of curbs are different, as evidenced by the present dispensation's dismal record when it comes to the use of central agencies to rein in dissenting voices in political battles against the opposition. Any criticism of the government is fraught with danger for the average citizen not keen on spending time in police custody or jail, or having their premises raided by the Enforcement Directorate and other state agencies. The authorities have used financial audits and investigations against rights groups and media companies, and even used arbitrary measures like preventing people from traveling abroad to inform international opinion. Now, the curbs on dissent and protests have occurred through a combination of coercive and non-coercive means. Coercive means include the criminalization of dissent through the sedition provisions of the Penal Code, and non-coercive means include efforts to roll back civil society in various ways, including accusing it of being anti-national. Painting civil society organizations as anti-national is not new for illiberal regimes. What is new is the attempt to raise the confrontation between state and civil society to the level of war, as was done by the National Security Advisor in his recent speech to the Indian Police Service probationers at their graduation parade at the National Police Academy, I think in Hyderabad. Dissent and questioning of government has come to be treated as sedition, and extraordinary laws have been used for this, and numerous sedition cases have been filed against dissenters, reflecting the ruling party's will to minimize opposition on the streets. Now, the effects of all this are, of course, very stark, and of course vary from state to state. But these tactics, which are commonly associated with authoritarian, are commonly associated with authoritarian regimes and not democracy. In fact, India tops the world in the number of internet shutdowns that have been imposed by the government in 2019 and now and then after that as well. Now, this politics, or the politics of the BJP, is really built on targeting of minorities, and of course, Muslims have been the prime targets of violence and discrimination. Now, basically, there have been numerous campaigns that have been launched, and we are in the midst of many of those campaigns, which include measures against the meat industry, shutting down slaughterhouses and shops that allegedly did not conform to laws and regulations. And several states have passed laws to ban religious conversion, which is in fact permissible under the Constitution. States have passed not just cow protection laws, but also laws which empower vigilance to enforce cow protection. Now, in the past, vigilance might fear police reprisals for their actions, but since 2014, these groups have been protected by political leaders who are in a position to influence the government from within. And spearheading this are of course, some right-wing organizations which engage in cultural policing through physical threats and intimidation, often translating into violence and lynching of minorities. Now, these groups have played a key part in advancing the ruling party's majoritarian agenda of making India a Hindu nation. Now, basically, I mean, apart from yeah. One second, I think I've got it. Okay. So this is as far as majoritarianism is concerned, and then we move towards authoritarianism. Now, the contemporary political order in India is fundamentally authoritarian and highly centralized. Centralization has grown immensely in the past 7 years, and the common thread running through this process is authoritarian control of constitutional and regulatory institutions and an overall erosion of democratic norms. The drive for top down control has targeted all public institutions which are intended to serve as checks and balances on the unmitigated exercise uh, of executive power, not the least investigative and coercive agencies. The state and its agencies have been used to the full extent required for dominating all the power centers, including state governments, as much as possible. The government has tried to prevail over the country's institutions either by constraining their power or limiting their independence. This has been done through the appointment of people loyal to the regime, and in many cases, positions are filled by trusted bureaucrats who have worked with the Prime Minister in Gujarat. Now, the desire for absolute control has reportedly meant that individual ministers have little authority in most cases, not even the right to select their own officers, while civil servants are expected to be subservient. As we know, the Prime Minister prefers to take major decisions with minimum possible consultation, possibly emanating from his desire to shock and awe. The disastrous demonetization decision in November 2016 was an example, was an extreme example, I should say, of this strategy, which ended up damaging the economy. In fact, 5 years later, we are still to recover from the aftershocks of that decision. But given that many senior cabinet ministers were unaware of the demonetization decision until shortly before it was announced, the announcement highlighted the worst kept secret about this regime, that the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office is really the only power center. Now, the autonomy of essential institutions is clearly under question as the government seeks to influence them politically. The credibility of institutions such as the Election Commission, the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Reserve Bank of India, media, and universities has been compromised. The Election Commission of India has increasingly been seen as acceding to the wishes of the BJP, of the ruling party, rather than acting neutrally as it is supposed to do. Similar methods were reportedly used against the judiciary to control it or to sort of, in a certain sense, browbeat it into submission, or at least being accommodative towards the executive. And this happened under 3 successive Chief Justices of India, which was a hat trick, really, of a kind. Of course, the present Chief Justice is different, and he has, to some extent, restored the autonomy of the Supreme Court. It remains to be seen what the next Chief Justices will do. So the impartial functioning of the judiciary and law enforcement has been compromised. Although institutions have always had to negotiate with political rulers, and there have been periods in India's past when things came to a flashpoint, as during the emergency. But never before constitutional institutions have had to function for political ends to this extent when there's no formal declaration of emergency. This process begins, I should say, with the undermining of Parliament and the abandonment of any meaningful discussion there. And indeed, I think the starkest, almost striking example of that is is the passage of the 3 controversial farm laws, which were passed without any discussion or debate. And then eventually, in the face of this remarkable farmers' movement, they were repealed. But they were repealed just as they were passed, without discussion and debate. Now, passing such important bills as the farm laws, which would have changed Indian agriculture and corporatized it in the face of such huge opposition, and to do so without debate, while ignoring the need for deliberation, has clearly choked the parliamentary process. And as I said, the manner in which the farm bills were passed as an indication is perhaps the greatest indication of this. Now, the erosion of autonomy of the Election Commission is part of the same story of exerting absolute control over institutions. High-stake elections invariably throw up situations where the Election Commission doesn't have to be fair, doesn't just have to be fair, it also has to appear to be fair and neutral. This hasn't been the case in recent years. This position, or its position, has been compromised by the erosion of the Election Commission's credibility owing to partisan decisions that are seen to be supportive of the ruling party, especially its top leadership. And critics rightly point to the breaches of the model code of conduct that haven't been dealt with impartially and firmly, thus giving a fillip to the process of electoral majoritarianism. The government, for its part, has limited the Election Commission, the Election Commission's authority from within by appointing blind election commissioners, a tactic that has affected other institutions also. Now, but the declining autonomy of this particular institution, that is to say, the Election Commission, is something very significant, because that has unleveled the playing field and contributed to distortions in electoral politics. Now, if Parliament and the Election Commission is no longer an effective check on the executive, much the same can be said about the judiciary, and the Supreme Court's role in the production of the NRC in Assam, its judgment in the Ayodhya dispute, which I mentioned at the beginning, its apparent lack of urgency in hearing challenges against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the abrogation of Article 370, which has been challenged in the court, and above all, the unresolved controversy over electoral bonds, which again has unleveled the electoral field, because the ruling party is virtually has access to humongous amounts of money thanks to the electoral bond. Something like 90% of electoral bond money has gone to the ruling party. And there are very serious questions about the validity, transparency of these electoral bonds. And yet the Supreme Court has not taken up any of the issues, all of which are extremely important for, it hasn't really taken up any of these issues. In fact, one gets the sense that it is simply avoiding pronouncing on controversial issues that strongly affect governmental interest. In fact, the Supreme Court has not even taken up habeas corpus petitions. As a result, people are languishing in jail for months. So during the term of at least 3 of the Chief Justices that I mentioned earlier, not the present one, the court simply stopped opposing the executive, either by dismissing potentially embarrassing petitions or simply abstaining from taking up a case for months or years. Now, whether this can be explained in terms of governmental pressure or appointment of pliant judges or ideological affinities on many issues, such as Ayodhya or Uniform Civil Code or the issue of illegal migrants, that remains an open question. Of course, the NRC issue is a striking example in which chief justices have expressed the same point of view as the ruling party. The fact that key institutions seem to have been captured by people who share, at least in part, the worldview of the Hindu right, and in some cases are even connected to them, suggests the entrenchment of Hindu dominance, not outside the state, but now as part of the state. In the event, an authoritarian state may exert coercion more directly by distorting electoral competition, changing the law, and using state agencies and its security apparatus to suppress and contain opposition. As a result, the previously level playing field can be tilted sharply to the advantage of those in power. And indeed, that is exactly what has happened. The unequal access to financial resources, biased media, and lack of impartiality among institutions of those in charge in organizing polls seriously limits political opposition. This is not surprising because authoritarianism finds its greatest expression in neutralizing the opposition, but also any institutional power center. Intimidating and stifling the opposition is an avowed objective of authoritarian governments anywhere. Two of the most common such tactics include politicizing the prosecution of political opponents by bringing cases against opposition politicians and selective application of law against them. This government has used the electoral mandate to dispense with consultation even on issues of national importance, and it has denied the legitimacy of political opponents, most notably the Congress Party, as evident from the explicit objective of a Congress Mukt Bharat or Congress Free India. However, this mission is not limited to the Congress alone. It extends essentially to an opposition-free nation ruled by one party. Now, in conclusion, then, the growing centralization of power, control of institutions, and abuse of authority has enabled the ruling party to reshape the Indian state and democracy as the checks and balances intended to restrain executive power have been diluted. The new political order is essentially authoritarian, which is defined by the limits it places on political pluralism through the use of state agencies to clip the wings of the opposition. It seeks to neutralize dissent, which was evident from the quashing and the sort of suppression of the anti-CAA protests, and curtailing opposition parties in a bid to promote its own dominance of the system. Authoritarian control, which involves neutralizing public institutions, facilitates the majoritarian takeover of institutions. The control the government exerts over key institutions has enabled the ruling party to reshape Indian state and democracy during its second term. Furthermore, the polarization of the electoral process and the emasculation of institutions underscores the continuum between majoritarianism and authoritarianism, with both reinforcing each other, which is really at the center of my argument. However, the last few months have shown cracks in the facade of majoritarian authoritarian rule, which is caught between the conflicting poles of diversity and discontent. The biggest challenge the ruling party is facing is imposing its majoritarian authoritarian regime on a society as large as India, and on a society and on Indian society with its great diversity of language, religion, dress, food habits, history, identity, and cultural loyalty to these identities is sometimes more important than Hindu identity. In short, India is much too complex for the simplistic othering and a sort of subordination of this multiplicity of identities which are part of India's social and cultural landscape. So the last few years, and especially the last 2 years, one should say, have been a real revelation in this regard, not just for the ruling party, but even for its critics. There's growing resistance to the authoritarian tendencies of the government and its policies. Several modes of resistance have gathered momentum outside the traditional party politics in response to increasing polarization and to the far-reaching restructuring of democracy, which has proceeded apace. The defiance of farmers and ultimately their victory, which is to say the government actually succumbed to the farmers' movement and repealed all the laws. It has the 3 farm laws. It has withdrawn the numerous cases against farmers and has promised something akin to a minimum support price, not quite what they want, but to some extent, some kind of guaranteed price. So the farmers' movement, I mean, this extraordinary farmers' movement, which was perhaps one of the largest social movements in the world, sustained, determined, huge in scale, and eventually they prevailed. Even though this is a majority government, a powerful government, yet, as I said, people's power, so to speak, prevailed. And in that sense, I think the farmers' movement and its success is a turning point in Indian democracy. But I would say even the anti-CAA movement, though not as successful as the farmers' movement in compelling the government to withdraw these laws, was nonetheless a very significant movement. So the farmers' movement, the anti-CAA movement, and so on. All of these movements have and the growing criticism of government policies and the manner in which it is functioning shows that while our rulers may have power, and indeed even absolute power, their sway does not extend over everyone. Major public protests, two of which I consider extremely important, which is to say the farmers' movement and the equal citizenship movement, I think they have put the government on the back foot. And so citizens have risen against this combination of majoritarianism and authoritarianism in defense of equal rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, and have mounted some measure of resistance to the transformation of India into a Hindu state, a transformation that was clearly accelerated by the re-election of this government in 2019. Now, the strong-arm response of the government to these movements, especially the citizenship protests, underlines the proclivity of the government towards authoritarianism and its insistence on using it in the service of Hindu nationalism and the attainment of unbridled power. But even if the CAA protest, which, as I said, was an extremely significant protest, it may not have had an immediate impact, or it may not have any, or many of these protests may not have an immediate electoral impact. They do open the door for the gradual erosion of authoritarianism and the questioning of majoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. This is really enlightening, and especially your argument and the conclusions note with some sort of positivity on, especially in the part of democracy and sustaining the democratic debate in India. And also, I would like to thank you that the way you have touched upon almost all the aspects of Indian politics, especially the institutions, politics, political mobilizations, the farmers movement, and the entire debate of equal citizenship rights, which rather I also quite agree that instead of calling it an anti-CAA, but just call equal rights movement. Equal citizenship movement is thanks for this. Now, we'll have some time left for the Q&A sessions. If anyone here, an esteemed audience, would like to raise, or you have comments, or you have any direct questions, please unmute yourself and you can address to our keynote speaker. Well, there are few, of course, if you can type your questions in the chat box, we have our volunteers who will also help us in.
Can I go?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, ma'am, for this discussion, starting with majoritarianism and then authoritarianism, and how there is a glimpse of hope with respect to farmers' movement and also the equal citizenship movement. So, as a student academic, I would like to ask what should be the urgent, on an urgent basis, what should be the areas of research that we need to focus, which would not just be research, but also a kind of activism, which would contribute to that.
Also, a kind of, I didn't hear the last part.
Activism in deepening democracy. So what is the major areas of research that you think we should now, as citizens and students, focus on?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I would say that we really, for example, need to do some work on authoritarianism. There is work on authoritarianism in India, but that is with regard to the emergency. But we need to examine authoritarianism today, because we are witnessing authoritarianism without a formal declaration of the emergency. So I think that's one area of work. But equally significantly, I think right-wing politics and right-wing populism is, I think, another area of exploration. I mean, of course, there's a whole debate about whether we should call the BJP as a populist party or a communal party, and so on. So in a sense, we also need to examine the nature and character of India's right, which is different from the right in other countries. And that has something to do with the fact that the BJP is closely linked to the RSS, which is a social movement and at the same time seeks to control the state, which they're doing now. Now, in no other country do you have a right-wing party which is closely associated with a whole phalanx of right-wing organizations, which are cultural, which are economic, which are political, and so on. So I think the specificity of the Indian right is something that needs to be examined. But so populism is certainly an important area. But at the same time, I think there is now so much work that is being done on the right, or on the Hindu right, if you will, that I think the opposition to them, which is significant, is not being has not been sufficiently studied. So I think oppositional politics and oppositional movements, both which are essentially non-party opposition, is an interesting area to examine. Then I think what is happening in the state is another area, because actually the opposition is much greater in the states than at the center. So I think we need to really, that's another very, very important area of analysis, state politics and so on. And so these are at least 3 or 4 areas, broadly speaking, that I think are important. But of course, there are many other areas as well.
Thank you, ma'am. That answers really well.
Thanks, Sania, for your questions. Now we have few more questions in our chat box. One is by Murshid Alam. Equal citizenship protest, so beautifully put. What directions do you think Muslim politics in India is going to take after such protest?
That too is a good question. I'd like to hear from all of you what you think. But I think the equal citizenship protest was so important because, well, after a long time, Muslims came out to protest and to assert their rights, but they did so in association with others. I think what was significant about the citizenship protests was that people who participated in these protests came from different social backgrounds, class backgrounds, religious backgrounds. I think we would be making a mistake if we treat the equal citizenship protest as only a Muslim protest. I think, but as far as Muslims were concerned, and they were certainly very prominent in this protest, was their emphasis on a kind of constitutional patriotism or a constitutional politics. So there was a new grammar of protest. And I think this new grammar of protest put Muslims centrally in the larger framework of Indian politics rather than, being separate and distinct. Now, I think so. What Muslims need to do is to continue that frame of reference, which we saw in the equal citizenship protest, which is that I think it is if protests would be and opposition would be effective when Muslims work along with other groups rather than separately.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Another, Manzar, yeah. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for putting everything so beautifully. There is hardly any space for a question because you have summarized things in such a beautiful way. Manzar ma'am from Jamia Millia Islamia, I would like to know your inputs about the departure points in the last 2 major protests in India, the anti-CAA protest or movement and the farmers movement. What differentiates one from the other? And what are the lessons that we should take home from the farmers' protest as being a successful protest? Because this question is going to come back again, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think another very interesting and important question, and in fact, I would say, apropos the earlier, or the first question, that this is another area of analysis, is to do a comparative study of movements, and comparing the anti-CAA movement and the farmers' movement would be is very interesting. Now, clearly, these movements are significant but different. The equal citizenship movement was was of course non-party. So was the farmers' movement, but in the citizenship movement, political parties were reluctant to be seen to be supporting this movement. In case of the farmers' movements, political parties may not be there, but they have been very keen to associate with the farmers' movement, and they want to support it. Now, of course, this has to do with the nature of issues that were at stake. In case of the farmers' movement, in case of the citizenship movement, it was a whole question of citizenship and religion came in, whereas farmers' movement was much more material. It was really a much more materialist movement. It was not. It had nothing to do with religion, and it concerned agriculture, which affects 60 or 70% of people in India, and therefore that is an issue that has much wider concern, much wider resonance. Now, the citizenship, the CAA, really affected mainly Muslims. But I think what is very interesting is that even though this affected only Muslims, and that too if the CAA is linked to NRC, and yet so many non-Muslims supported this movement, even though they were not going to be affected by it. There was no danger or threat, really speaking, to their citizenship. Secondly, of course, the scale of the movements is different. Scale in terms of numbers of people, and also in terms of the sheer length of the movement. Now, the citizenship movement really lasted for roughly 3 months, but you could say maybe even 2 months. Whereas the farmers' movement went on for almost 15 months, but most definitely for at least 12 months. So the citizenship movement was spread to, even though Shaheen Bagh was in a certain sense, was the most prominent site of this movement, but it spread to different parts of the country. Whereas the farmers' movement was really focused on 3 major sites on the borders of the capital. But the real difference between the two movements is not really in terms of participation, in terms of character, participation, or issues. The real difference is in terms of the attitude of the government and political parties. As I said in the beginning, the government was determined to brutally suppress the equal citizenship movement, whereas it tried strong arm tactics with the farmers' movement as well, demonizing them, calling them Khalistanis and so on. But it didn't really work. So, and above all, the government entered into negotiations. It held 9 rounds of talks with the farmers' movement. Even the court treated the two campaigns or movements very differently. The Supreme Court was willing to set up a committee it set up a committee to examine the demands of farmers, whereas obviously nothing of the kind was done with regard to the citizenship movement. So clearly, I think more than people, it is actually state and parties which treated these two movements differently. Political parties which are non-BJP parties were wary, even though they were concerned about the CAA and were not in favor of it. And yet they didn't want to really go out. I mean, they didn't want to take to the streets. But in the case of farmers' movement, it's very different. So I think there is something very interesting and worth a comparison between these two movements, because that reflects on politics, that reflects on on the politics of movements and on the politics of the state, and in a certain sense, it tells us about the direction of our democracy.
Thank you so much. Now, Professor Rafat Ali, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mateen, for this opportunity, and it was an honor to listen to Professor Hassan. I have an observation to make rather than a question, because I am from the literature department, but to hear a political scientist speak, it also, it's really adds a new perspective. This was regarding the question on the direction of the future direction of Muslim politics. And it suddenly reminded me, and because what Professor Hassan was saying about majoritarianism and authoritarianism and all that. And I was reminded of somewhere I had read in what is called, in the traditions, the Hadith Qudsi. Somewhere I had read. Hadith Qudsi means not where the Prophet is reported by some companion, but where it's a non-Quranic saying of what God says to the Prophet, where it says that be it privilege or be it deprivation, they should be used responsibly. So deprivation also helps us understand the nature of oppression better, and then it defines one's participation in that resistance in a more responsible way, rather than simply entering into some kind of a contending for power. And because it's very interesting, because the majoritarianism that ma'am was talking about is, I guess we all are kind of agreed on that it is religion. But it's very ironic, because religion is something that is supposed to liberate, but it is the same religion which it appeals to, which means that something in the way religion is being interpreted, and it is finding the same kind of like-mindedness in the same kind of people who hold similar views of religion. So I'd like to know your views, ma'am, on is this something where religion hardly has a role to play, or is it something else that is working that fuels the hatred and finds so much legitimacy?
Well, that's an interesting question, which is worth thinking about. But I think what we are witnessing is the politicization of religion. Now, for some people, it may be genuinely about religion and sort of giving, and people wanting Hinduism to be given greater public prominence and so on. But the fact is that as far as the ruling party is concerned, they are politicizing religion, and there is an attempt at political construction and consolidation of the Hindu community to use them to advance their political project and to use them to win elections. So I think this is not something which is, which is just natural and it's intrinsic, although that is how it might be presented. But the fact of the matter is that this is, this is politicization. It's political construction of religion. It is using Hinduism to advance political interests, as far as which is not unusual. If we look at Islamism in other countries, or political Islam, likewise, this is political Hinduism, which is not to say that there aren't people who are generally or genuinely interested in the in the religion per se. But what we are talking about, and I think what you are talking about certainly is political religion, and which is why it is problematic, and it creates divisions and polarization. Because I mean, look at what is happening in UP in the run-up to the elections. There's clearly, I mean, there's a very deliberate attempt to create divisions in order to gain support. Now, the question then is that why should people fall for it? Now, do people fall for it because they are religious-minded and find that this is a party which is agreeable to them for that reason? Or is it that they too are sort of taken in by the majoritarian argument that we are in a majority and we should be given preference?
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank
There
you so
are
much, ma'am.
inbox is flooded with questions. I won't be writing all these questions now. Ma'am, just two more questions we would like to take, and if you permit.
Yeah.
Yeah. These are questions by Kothuru Paramkumar. He's saying that communal and authoritarian BJP winning Lok Sabha and Assembly by defeating secular parties. In this matter, what are the role of other communal parties? I mean, like, I don't know the questions like what he wanted to say, but role of other communal parties, maybe Shiv Sena kind of party or party which directly believes in
There are
the
Muslim communal parties too.
yeah.
I mean, after all, parties, whether it is the MIM or the Abbas Siddiq party, even if it calls itself the Indian Secular Front, in Bengal, is an example of a communal party. So I think it's not just Hindu parties, but there are Muslim parties as well. They are maybe few and far between, and fortunately, they don't seem to get that much support, as was evident from the failure of Abbas Siddiq to win. Well, I think he won one seat, if I'm not mistaken, in the Bengal assembly elections. So I think, but then there is MIM, which was very active in the Bengal elections and will again be active in the UP elections. So Muslim communal parties are also, I mean, they are in a way they sort of embolden, so to speak, the Hindu communal parties, because in a way they are made for each other.
Thank you, ma'am. Just last questions, and this is also my own personal questions as well. Ma'am, I was reading Sammi Smuha's, Professor Sammi Smuha's writing on ethnic democracy, and Christophe Jaffello has very liberally used that theoretical framework and use in India. How do you think, like to what extent India is going towards the path of ethnic democracy?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that is another issue that needs to be debated and explored. Whether it is right to call India an ethnic democracy, because if we call it an ethnic democracy, in a way, in some respects, it's accurate, but not to the extent that ethnicity is important, and there is an attempt to establish an ethnic vote, so to speak. But somehow calling it an ethnic democracy, I find also problematic, because it does give legitimacy to ethnicity. And ethnicity in the Indian context simply means communal. And that, I think, by calling it ethnic, we are in a way diluting the significance and the problems associated with communal politics, which is a central problem. So ethnic democracy, and also, the concept of ethnic democracy has been used in the Israeli context principally. Now, of course, Israel and India are different, but there are now obviously some similarities too between the way politics is proceeding in these two countries. So, ethnic democracy, I think, not sure if I would use that term. I would still call it, a communal authoritarian system or a communal system rather than ethnic democracy.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much for your insight. The final questions, and then we will close this session. Yeah, I could see Sania, Mariam, and Riaz Ahmed.
Yeah.
Just
Thank you.
be short. Yeah.
Okay. So, ma'am, you just mentioned that CNRC targeted primarily Muslims, and then there was a new grammar of protest which was led by Muslims. So, but I also see a hesitancy in calling it a Muslim protest. So, recently we have seen this assertion of identity, and yes, we are Muslims, and yes, we are being targeted, and yes, we will protest as Muslims. But at the same time, there's a generational gap where I see people who have witnessed or heard stories of partition, or they hesitate from stripping down to only Muslim as one of their primary identities to fight this thing. And I'm so conflicted between this. As why is it like that? I don't know whether I'm able to explain myself.
No, I haven't followed what you're saying. You're saying there's conflict between Muslim identity and a secular identity.
No, I'm saying that there is like you said, that we shouldn't call it a Muslim protest, the CNRC protest.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But why is there this hesitancy of calling it when we know that Muslims were being targeted and Muslims did lead the protest?
It's one thing to say that Muslims were being targeted, but to call it a Muslim protest is not accurate, because non-Muslims were a significant part of that protest. So why should we call it a Muslim protest? And Muslims themselves were not fighting for Muslim rights. They were fighting for constitutional rights. So this is not as though you are fighting for the preservation of Muslim personal law, which is a specifically Muslim issue. Citizenship is, even if Muslims were being targeted, is not a Muslim issue. It's a constitutional issue. It's an issue about constitutional rights, about constitutional ideals. It is about an egalitarian democracy which makes no distinctions between people based on religion. So this is we have to also look at the issues. These are not Muslim issues. Even if Muslims were being excluded, I think it's extremely important not to call it a Muslim protest. And I am aware, and I know the issue you have raised is important, because a lot of Muslims were keen to call it a Muslim protest precisely because there were many others who were reluctant to do so. And somehow Muslims felt that this was kind of denying agency to them. Here they've organized the movement, they've led it, they've dominated it, and so on. And yet they were not being given due credit for it. But I think that's exactly what the government also wanted. The government wanted to call it a Muslim protest, and one of the reasons why eventually it was petering out in January of 2020, much before the lockdown and the pandemic, was because the government was successful in painting it as, and therefore dismissing it as, a Muslim concern, Muslim anxiety, and therefore a Muslim protest. And so a lot of people would hesitate then to associate with a sectarian movement. So I think there is a certain, for the reason that I've just mentioned, it is extremely important not to fall into the trap of calling it a Muslim protest movement.
Thank you, ma'am. We don't have much time now. If ma'am, you permit, this Riyaz Saab has raised his hand, and if you permits, I can allow him to ask a question.
Well, you're chairing it, so you have to allow.
No, no, ma'am, it's up to you.
No,
If
no,
you
it's
are,
okay. It's
Riyaz
all,
Saab, please go ahead. This is the final one.
yeah. Please go ahead.
Unmute yourself, Riyaz Saab. Uh, okay, must be some technical issues. Ma'am, there's another questions by Aklima Hassan. Uh, and I'm reading out that questions. Will it be always something materialistic to get support across the communities? As we have seen in the case of farmers' protest, what is their idea of India if law like CAA doesn't bother rest of the communities? I think ma'am has already answered these questions, but if you want to say a few further more lines, then please go ahead, ma'am. Otherwise, we will
So, what
formally.
is the question?
The question is that will it be always something materialistic to get support across the communities, as we have seen in the case of farmers' protest? What is the idea of India if law like CAA does not bother rest of the communities?
But it did bother people. I don't think it's right to say that it didn't bother people now. I mean, after all, even the farmers' movement, it's not as though just about everybody was on the street backing the farmers' movement. So why? So for us to, it did bother people. A lot of people who were not going to be affected in any way by the CA were out there. They were out on the streets. Look at what happened in universities across the country. So many universities, students came out to protest against the brutal police action in Jamia Millia or in Aligarh Muslim University. So I think it is unfair not to note and recognize the wide support that the equal citizenship protests garnered.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much. Now I would like to formally invite Professor Zahira Hussain to propose formal vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Matin sir. Am I audible properly? Just
Yes.
yeah. Thank you so much. Yes, ma'am. Actually, I would like to apologize. I am facing some network issues today, so I am unable to put my video on. So I have to speak like this. So thank you so much for providing me with this opportunity to deliver the formal vote of thanks on behalf of the Bengali Academia for Social Empowerment. And as Matin sir has already shared this information with all of you, we are organizing this year's conference in collaboration with Dr. B.R. Ambedkar College and Ambedkar Center of Go Vidyalaya, Malda. So I am absolutely honored. I'm feeling absolutely honored to deliver this formal vote of thanks for the session and for the keynote speaker, which is delivered by such an eminent personality. So from the organizers, on behalf of the organizers, I sincerely thank you, ma'am, for delivering this wonderful, wonderful lecture. The amount of questions that we have received, the kind of support and the kind of reactions and response that we have received from all the participants absolutely speak out loud for the wonderful lecture that you have delivered. Thank you, really thank you. And I would also want to sort of apologize for the faulted communications from our part, and you have been generous enough. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, for being so generous, to with us. Thank you, and we definitely look forward to have you for all our sessions for this entire conference. Like we have 2 plenaries today, and then we have other plenaries tomorrow and the day after. So we really welcome you, and we would really appreciate it if you are with us throughout this conference. Thank you once again. And thank you so much, Professor Abdul Mateen, for chairing this session. Without your support, this conference actually wouldn't have been the way it is actually happening. Thank you to both of you for setting the tone of the conference. It is really wonderful. And I would also like to thank all the participants who have attended this keynote address and who have shared their questions, who have engaged with us with such sort of a warm response. So thanks to all of you. Thanks, Dr. Rafat Ali sir, Murshid sir, and everyone who have posted their questions, who have interacted with ma'am and with us. And I would also request all of you to be with us. We have our next plenary starting just within a couple of minutes after this, right after this session. So please be with us, and we have long 3 days to go. We absolutely hope to have this engaging process going on. Thank you once again to everyone. Please take care. Over to you, Matin sir. Thank you, ma'am, once again.
Thank you very much. It was very
Thank you so
wonderful.
much. Yes. Thank you,
Very
ma'am.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank
Mr. Hassan, please proceed. Hassan Dhabak bhai, please go ahead.
Yes. Yes. So, yes, let me just. Okay, thank you, ma'am. মানে আমি রেকর্ডিংটা অন অফ করে আমি নেক্সট সেশন যাচ্ছি, সো আমি